Making sense of a world in crisis. Have you ever had the experience of sitting down to read the news, genuinely intending to understand what is happening in the world, and rising from that experience 30 minutes later, feeling not more informed but more confused, not more capable of making sense of the forces shaping your life, but more overwhelmed by the sheer volume and velocity of events that seem to be accelerating beyond any framework you have for organizing them into coherent meaning? Have you ever looked at the simultaneous crises unfolding across every domain of human civilization? The political crises, and the ecological crises, and the technological crises, and the economic crises, and the cultural crises, and felt not the productive discomfort of a person grappling seriously with complex realities, but something closer to the paralysis of a person who has been handed a puzzle whose pieces do not seem to belong to the same picture? It is a world in which several of the most fundamental assumptions that human beings have used to organize reality, to distinguish signal from noise, to understand cause and effect, to locate themselves in time and in relation to their communities and their future, are being simultaneously destabilized in ways that have no adequate historical precedent. And the inability to make sense of this world, the specific cognitive and emotional experience of living inside a crisis whose dimensions exceed the frameworks available for understanding it, is itself one of the most important things to understand about the moment we are living in. This feeling is not a personal failure of intelligence or attention. It is not the symptom of a mind that is not trying hard enough to understand. It is the entirely appropriate response of a human cognitive system that was designed to process a very different kind of world, being asked to make sense of a world that is, in several simultaneous and mutually reinforcing ways, genuinely unprecedented. The feeling of not being able to make sense of what is happening is not a failure of perception. It is, in a very real sense, an accurate perception. Because the world that is currently taking shape around us is not simply a more complex version of the world that previous generations navigated. Because how we respond to that inability, whether we reach for false simplicity that reduces genuine complexity to comfortable narratives, whether we collapse into paralysis and avoidance, or whether we develop the specific intellectual capacities required to navigate genuine complexity honestly, will determine not only our individual well-being but the collective capacity of human civilization to respond adequately to the challenges it currently faces. So let us begin by being precise about what kind of crisis this actually is. Because one of the most common and most damaging mistakes people make when trying to make sense of a world in crisis is to treat the current moment as simply a more intense version of crises that have occurred before, to reach for historical analogies that provide the comfort of familiarity while obscuring the specific features of the present situation that make it genuinely different and genuinely more difficult to navigate. Every generation has experienced crisis. Every era of human history has produced events that felt, to the people living through them, like the potential end of everything they knew and valued. The plague years of medieval Europe, the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, the revolutionary upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries, the two world wars, and the Depression, and the nuclear standoff of the 20th century. All of these were experienced by the people living through them as existential crises of the first order. And yet civilization survived them all, often damaged and diminished, always transformed, but recognizable on the other side as a continuation of the human project. This historical record is genuinely comforting, and it would be dishonest to dismiss it entirely. Human beings have demonstrated, again and again, a remarkable capacity to survive crises that seemed unsurvivable, to rebuild after catastrophes that seemed total, to find new frameworks for organizing collective life after the old ones had been shattered. The history of human civilization is, among other things, a history of crisis navigation, and the fact that we are here, having this conversation, is itself evidence that the species has managed so far. But the comfort of that historical record needs to be held carefully, because it contains within it a dangerous potential for misapplication. The crises of the past, however severe, had certain structural features in common that allowed them, eventually, to be navigated by the societies that faced them. They were, for the most part, crises within a stable framework, disruptions to a system whose fundamental architecture remained intact, even as specific features of it were violently transformed. The world wars were catastrophic, but they were fought within a world where nation-states remained the primary unit of political organization, where human beings remained the most capable cognitive actors in the system, where the basic structure of the biosphere remained stable, and where the fundamental categories through which people understood themselves and their place in the world, however shaken, remained recognizable. The frameworks were stressed. They were not dissolved. What is specifically different about the current moment is that several of the most fundamental frameworks through which human beings have navigated all previous crises are themselves under simultaneous assault. It is not that we are facing a crisis within a stable world. It is that the stability of the world itself, the stability of the political frameworks, the ecological frameworks, the informational frameworks, the cognitive frameworks, is what is in crisis. And making sense of a crisis that is happening at the level of the frameworks for making sense of things is an intellectually and psychologically unprecedented challenge. Let us be specific about what is actually destabilizing, because vagueness is one of the primary enemies of clear thinking about complex situations, and the temptation to gesture broadly at a world in crisis without being precise about the specific mechanisms of that crisis is a temptation that must be actively resisted. The first and perhaps most fundamental destabilization is happening at the level of shared reality itself. Human civilization has always depended, more than most people consciously realize, on the existence of a sufficient baseline of shared factual reality, a common ground of agreed-upon facts about the physical world, about historical events, about the basic functioning of social and political institutions, upon which disagreements about values and priorities and policies can be conducted in a way that is at least potentially productive. People can disagree, sometimes violently, about what should be done about a problem and still share a sufficient common understanding of what the problem actually is and what the relevant facts about it are for their disagreement to be meaningful. Without that common ground of shared reality, disagreement does not become more passionate or more intense. It becomes incoherent. It becomes a situation in which different groups are not arguing about what to do in response to a shared world, but are inhabiting entirely different worlds with entirely different facts, entirely different histories, entirely different understandings of what is happening and why. This dissolution of shared reality is not primarily a political phenomenon, though it has profound political consequences. It is primarily an informational and technological phenomenon, driven by the specific architecture of the digital information environment that has developed over the last 3 decades, and that has, with increasing efficiency and increasing consequence, replaced the relatively centralized information systems of the 20th century with a fragmented, algorithmically driven environment in which the information each person receives is shaped primarily not by its accuracy or its relevance to shared reality, but by its capacity to produce engagement, which turns out to be almost perfectly correlated with its capacity to produce emotional arousal, and almost perfectly uncorrelated with its accuracy. This is the first layer of the sense-making challenge. Not just that the world is complex, but that the information environment through which we try to understand that complexity is actively hostile to genuine understanding, structured around the production of emotional certainty rather than intellectual clarity, and optimizing for a form of engagement that is the opposite of the sustained, uncertain, self-correcting inquiry that genuine understanding of complex situations requires. The second destabilization is happening at the level of political authority and institutional legitimacy. The practical consequence of this is a world in which billions of people are receiving information about the same events through systems specifically optimized to show each person the version of those events most likely to confirm their existing beliefs, provoke their existing emotional responses, and deepen their existing tribal identities. The result is not merely that people disagree about what to do about shared problems. It is that they increasingly disagree about the basic facts of what is happening, and that this disagreement is not random or symmetrical, but is systematically driven by algorithms whose incentive structures have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with engagement time. The world in which we are trying to make sense of a world in crisis is a world in which the primary mechanisms through which most people receive information about that crisis are specifically designed to make accurate sense-making more difficult. For most of the period since the Second World War, The dominant political framework in most of the world's wealthiest and most influential societies was some version of liberal democratic governance, understood broadly as a system in which legitimate authority derives from the consent of the governed, is constrained by constitutional rules and independent institutions, and is subject to regular, peaceful, competitive renewal through elections. This framework was never perfectly realized in any society, was always contested at its edges and sometimes at its core, and was in many cases applied with a selectivity and hypocrisy that undermined its stated principles. But it provided, for several decades, a relatively stable architecture of political legitimacy that allowed societies to navigate serious disagreements without descending into the kind of violence that had characterized previous eras. That architecture is now under a form of stress that is qualitatively different from the stresses it has faced before. The stress is not primarily external, not primarily from ideological competitors offering an alternative model of governance. It is primarily internal, driven by the growing perception, across many different societies and across many different political orientations, that existing institutions are not actually delivering what they promise, that the processes of democratic governance are being systematically shaped by concentrations of wealth and power that are formally outside the system while being practically dominant within it, that the people nominally in charge of the major decisions are not actually in charge, and that the institutional frameworks designed to hold power accountable are themselves too compromised by their relationship with power to perform that function reliably. This perception is not simply a product of disinformation or manipulation, though disinformation and manipulation certainly amplify it. It reflects real and measurable features of how power actually operates in contemporary societies. The concentration of wealth at historically unprecedented levels, the capacity of concentrated economic power to shape regulatory environments, media narratives, and political processes in ways that systematically serve the interests of those with resources over those without. The increasing evidence that the formal mechanisms of democratic accountability, elections, legislatures, courts, regulatory agencies, are insufficient to meaningfully constrain the behavior of the most powerful actors in a global system that these mechanisms were not designed to govern. When people lose faith in institutions, they do not typically replace institutional trust with a more sophisticated, more individualized form of civic engagement. They typically replace it with one of two things: either withdrawal, a retreat into private life accompanied by the conclusion that nothing in the political realm is worth serious attention or engagement, or the search for a different kind of authority, an authority based not on institutional legitimacy but on personal loyalty, on the promise of strength and decisiveness, and the willingness to cut through the complexity and corruption of existing institutions and deliver simple, powerful solutions to the problems those institutions have failed to solve. Neither of these responses is adequate to the actual challenges that political institutions need to address. Withdrawal removes from the civic sphere exactly the people most capable of improving institutional performance. The turn toward personalist authority tends to produce exactly the dynamic we described in our previous discussion of why fools rule the world, the selection of leaders based on the performance of strength and decisiveness, rather than the reality of competence and judgment, with consequences that are historically quite predictable and quite grim. The third destabilization is the one that receives the most media coverage, but perhaps the least genuine understanding, and that is the technological transformation that is reshaping the conditions of human economic and cognitive life faster than the institutional and psychological frameworks required to navigate it can adapt. We have discussed in previous conversations the specific ways in which artificial intelligence is transforming the labor market, the information environment, and the relationship between human cognitive capability and machine capability. But in the context of making sense of a world in crisis, the most important thing to understand about the technological transformation is not any specific application or any specific economic consequence. It is the general effect of living through a period of technological acceleration that is, by objective measures, the fastest in human history. And that is happening simultaneously across every domain of human life, rather than in the sequential, domain-by-domain pattern that characterized previous technological revolutions. The speed of technological change matters for crisis navigation for a reason that is rarely discussed but is psychologically fundamental. Human beings make sense of their world, develop stable identities and stable expectations and stable frameworks for understanding cause and effect and planning for the future through a process that requires a certain degree of stability in the environment. Not total stability, not the absence of change, but change at a pace slow enough that the meaning-making process can keep up with it, that new experiences can be integrated into existing frameworks before those frameworks are disrupted by the next wave of change, that social and institutional responses to technological transformation can be developed and tested and refined before the technology has moved so far beyond them as to render those responses irrelevant. When technological change exceeds the pace at which human meaning-making can keep up with it, the result is not simply economic disruption or social dislocation, though both of these are serious consequences. The result is a specific psychological condition that has been described under various names, but that is most precisely characterized as a sense of chronic temporal disorientation. The feeling that the past is no longer a reliable guide to the present, that the present is no longer a reliable guide to the future, that the skills and knowledge and frameworks that allowed one to navigate the world effectively are becoming obsolete faster than new ones can be developed, and that the rate of this obsolescence is itself accelerating. This condition is not a form of mental illness. It is the normal psychological response to an abnormal rate of environmental change. But it is also, precisely because it is so widespread and so persistent, one of the most significant contributors to the political instability and the social fragmentation that are themselves among the defining features of the current crisis. The fourth destabilization, and in some respects the deepest and most consequential, is the ecological crisis, understood not merely as the specific problem of climate change, but as the broader reality that human civilization has, over the course of its development, been drawing down the natural systems upon which it depends at a rate that exceeds those systems' capacity to regenerate, and that several of the most critical of these systems are now approaching thresholds beyond which their capacity to support the conditions required for the continuation of human civilization in its current form becomes genuinely uncertain. The ecological crisis is the most difficult of the current crises to make sense of, not because the science is unclear. It is in fact among the most thoroughly established scientific consensus in the history of the relevant disciplines, but because its temporal structure is uniquely hostile to the cognitive architecture through which human beings normally process threats and motivate action. Our threat response systems evolved to respond to immediate, concrete, sensory threats, predators, hostile humans, physical dangers that could be seen and heard and smelled and that required rapid behavioral response. The ecological crisis operates on timescales, through mechanisms, and at spatial scales that are almost perfectly calibrated to evade these threat response systems. The threat is real, is measurable, is in many respects already unfolding in ways that are producing measurable human suffering. It is a predictable consequence of the specific mismatch between the structure of the threat and the structure of human threat response systems, combined with the specific incentive structures of an economic system that profits from the activities generating the threat and the specific information environment that makes sustained attention to complex, slow-moving dangers extraordinarily difficult to maintain in competition with the constant supply of emotionally stimulating but cognitively shallow content that the digital information environment produces in limitless quantities. But it is unfolding slowly enough and through mechanisms abstract enough that the automatic threat response systems that would mobilize effective political and behavioral response remain largely unmobilized, while the cognitive systems required to process the threat accurately are operating in exactly the kind of information environment we described earlier, one specifically optimized to produce emotionally, engaging content at the expense of accurate, complex, long-term thinking. The result is a civilization that has access to extraordinarily precise information about a potentially civilizational-level threat, that has developed the technological and organizational capacity to meaningfully address that threat. And that is, for reasons deeply embedded in the architecture of human psychology and human institutions, failing to mobilize that capacity at the scale and speed that the situation requires. This is not a mystery. Now hold all four of these simultaneous destabilizations in mind at once: the dissolution of shared reality, the crisis of institutional legitimacy, the cognitive and psychological consequences of accelerating technological change, and the ecological crisis, and ask yourself what it would take to navigate all four of them simultaneously, adequately, at the scale required, and within the time constraints that several of them impose. What kind of thinking would be required? What kind of institutions? What kind of political culture? What kind of relationship between citizens and information? What kind of relationship between the present and the future? The answer, I want to suggest, is not simply better policies or better leaders or better technology, though all of these would help in specific ways. The answer is a fundamental transformation in how human beings relate to complexity, to uncertainty, to disagreement, and to the kind of sustained, effortful, uncomfortable thinking that genuine sense-making in genuinely complex situations requires. And here is the most difficult and most important thing that needs to be said about that transformation. It is not primarily a transformation that can be imposed from the top down, through institutional reform or political change, however important those things are. It is primarily a transformation that has to happen at the level of individual cognition, at the level of how each person actually processes information, handles uncertainty, engages with disagreement, and maintains the kind of epistemic integrity that genuine sense-making requires in the face of constant pressure from information environments designed to subvert it. Let me be specific about what this transformation actually involves, because the phrase better thinking is so generic as to be practically useless without the specific content that gives it meaning. The first element of the transformation is what I would call the cultivation of calibrated uncertainty. This sounds simple, but is in practice one of the most difficult cognitive habits to develop, because it runs directly against the grain of the social and emotional incentives that shape how most people handle uncertainty in practice. Calibrated uncertainty means holding beliefs with a degree of confidence that accurately reflects the actual strength of the evidence supporting them, neither more nor less. It means saying, I am not sure when you are genuinely not sure, not as a social performance of humility, but as an accurate representation of your actual epistemic state. It means resisting the pressure, which is constant and comes from many directions simultaneously, to express more confidence than you actually feel, to pretend to a certainty you do not have, to simplify your genuine uncertainty into a clear position that can be communicated and defended in the rapid, adversarial exchanges that dominate most public discourse. This is genuinely difficult, because the social costs of expressed uncertainty are real and immediate, while the epistemic benefits of calibrated uncertainty are diffuse and long-term. A person who says, I think this is probably approximately right, but I hold the belief with significant uncertainty, and would update it substantially in response to the following kinds of evidence, is performing a cognitive behavior that is far more likely to be accurate than the person who says, I am certain, this is correct, and anyone who disagrees is either stupid or malicious. But in the social dynamics of most contemporary discourse, the second performance is rewarded with engagement and influence, while the first is punished with the social signal of weakness and indecision. Changing this requires not just individual cognitive discipline, but a cultural shift in what kinds of epistemic performance are socially valued, which is a much larger and much slower project. The second element is the development of what researchers call systems thinking, the capacity to reason about complex systems, their feedback loops, their nonlinearities, their emergent properties, and their tendency to produce outcomes that are systematically different from the intentions of the actors within them. Most of the crises we have been discussing are, at their core, systems problems. They emerge from the interaction of many different components, each operating according to its own logic, producing collective outcomes that no individual component intended and no individual actor controls. Climate change is a systems problem. The dysfunction of democratic institutions is a systems problem. The fragmentation of shared reality is a systems problem. The acceleration of technological disruption is a systems problem. But most of the cognitive tools that people use to make sense of complex events are not systems tools. They are narrative tools, designed to identify heroes and villains, to assign clear cause and effect relationships, to produce stories with beginnings and middles and ends, in which human intentions and human actions produce human-scale consequences. These narrative tools are not useless. They are extraordinarily powerful for certain kinds of sense-making. But applied to systems problems, they systematically produce misunderstanding because they impose a causal simplicity on situations that are actually driven by complex, non-linear interactions that do not reduce to the intentions or the failures or the malice of any identifiable set of actors. This is why so many of the most popular explanations for the current crisis, explanations that identify a small number of malicious or incompetent actors as the primary cause of civilizational dysfunction, are simultaneously emotionally compelling and analytically inadequate. They have the structure of a narrative, complete with identifiable villains and a clear causal mechanism, heroes versus villains. But the crisis we are navigating is not primarily a narrative. It is primarily a systems failure, and responding to it effectively requires understanding it as a systems failure, which means developing the specific cognitive tools that systems analysis requires and resisting the enormous social and emotional pressure to simplify it into a narrative that is more comfortable and more immediately satisfying, but that will reliably generate responses inadequate to the actual problem. The third element is the specific practice of what the philosopher of science Karl Popper called falsificationism, but that in its practical, everyday form is simply the habit of actively looking for evidence that might disconfirm your most cherished beliefs, rather than the much more natural and much more socially rewarded habit of looking for evidence that confirms them. This habit, which sounds obvious when described abstractly, is in practice one of the rarest and most difficult cognitive behaviors that human beings engage in, precisely because it runs against the deep grain of a social psychology that evolved to use belief alignment as a mechanism of group cohesion rather than as a mechanism of accurate world modeling. When you hold a belief about an important and emotionally charged topic, the natural tendency of the human cognitive system is to process information about that topic in a way that protects the belief from challenge. Confirming evidence is attended to, processed deeply, and retained. Disconfirming evidence is attended to briefly, processed superficially, and either discounted or forgotten. This tendency, confirmation bias as researchers call it, is not a sign of stupidity or intellectual laziness. It is the default setting of the human cognitive system operating according to its evolved logic in an environment where belief alignment with your group was more important for survival than accurate world modeling. But in the specific cognitive environment required to navigate genuine crisis, it is one of the most dangerous defaults that can be allowed to operate unchecked. Actively cultivating the habit of falsificationism, of deliberately seeking out the strongest possible versions of arguments against your own positions, of treating the discomfort of having your beliefs challenged as a signal of potentially valuable information rather than as a social threat to be defended against, is one of the most practical and most powerful things that any individual person can do to improve the quality of their own sense-making in a genuinely complex world. The fourth element is what I would call temporal extension, the deliberate cultivation of the capacity to think seriously about consequences that unfold over long time scales, rather than only about the immediate, near-term consequences that our evolved psychology naturally prioritizes. This is particularly crucial for navigating the specific crisis we are currently in, because several of its most consequential dimensions, particularly the ecological crisis and the long-term consequences of AI development, operate on timescales that are genuinely difficult for human cognitive systems to process with appropriate urgency. The research on temporal discounting, the tendency of human beings to weight future consequences far less heavily than present ones, even when the future consequences are objectively far larger, is among the most consistent and most disturbing findings in all of behavioral economics.